Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Deep Thoughts. On what I anticipate to be one of the last few weeks of summer in Southern California. Still pretty warm. There's your update. As promised, here is another episode in the series about the moon where we're going to break things down a little bit more than previous episodes. But there'll be a tremendous amount of overlap, of course. But I think that in all cases, what starts to happen with these episodes, it's almost like a Buddhist chant. The Buddhist chant has its variations, but it also has its repetition. And each time you go into that chant, each time you go into any type of mantra of thinking, new things occur to you. And sometimes it happens to me on the show and you get to hear it. Other times it's you. I'm saying the same old crap, but you're going off in a completely different direction that you've never been down before, that I have never conceived of. And every once in a while, those brilliant comments come into the comment section on YouTube or make it to the Facebook group. And man, it changes everything. So I did, the official deep dive into the journey from Earth, low orbit, to the moon, then the maneuver to separate the service module from the lunar module, or LEM. It's spelled LEM, but the acronym's LM, and so they just started calling it LEM, putting a vowel in there, just like the Egyptians used to do back in the day. And then, of course, this thing has to land on the moon safely, and then it has to exist in this incredible journey for days and days and days. It's actually astonishing how many days they want us to believe that they had portable energy sources to sustain these folks. It's absurd. It just occurred to me while preparing for this episode that, when it comes to oxygen that an individual has to have in order to stay alive, as well as water, right? The last mission of Apollo 17 was 12 days and 13 hours. So imagine trying to stay alive for 13 days anywhere on planet Earth, 12.5 days. So you could be anywhere you want in the world, but you're going to have to bring what you need to survive. And I mean, you're in a vacuum of a box. You don't have oxygen, you don't have water. You got to bring it all. Just trying to prepare for that solitude would be very interesting and expensive. But there's some of you that are divers. You do deep sea diving, with tanks and that sort of thing. I don't even know if they call it deep sea, probably not deep sea, but you have an amount of oxygen that you have to bring on your back to survive. How many tanks would you have to have on your back to breathe for 12 days? Now, obviously, when they're inside the service module, there's 3 of them together. When they supposedly crawl through this nose cone of the service module, the little capsule, to get into the LEM, then you have another environment. So you're keeping one environment, which is the service module capsule, whoever's staying up. In the case of Apollo 11, it was Michael Collins. And then Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong crawl into the LEM, and then they've got their little mission down on the ground. Theirs was a mere 8 days. So you have obviously some flight time, and then you have some down on the surface time. And I apologize, it is windy today, so the mic's going to go in and out of being bombarded. Now, in addition to all these tanks of air that we're going to have to bring, today they recycle urine into water, supposedly in the space station. We definitely know that's possible for many different, submarines, and, there's just a bunch of different uses of that technology. But in 69, it'd probably be cheaper just to drink water. But imagine how much you urinate in 8 days. Imagine how much you might defecate in 8 days. Yeah, let's say you're pent up a little bit because, you're on the moon. So your bowels lock up. But I bet by Apollo 17, a 12-day mission, I'm willing to bet you can't keep everything in your body that you're eating. Not that you eat a whole lot of like 16-ounce steaks or anything, but interesting. We could think about a moisture-absorbing diaper taking care of perhaps the fluids, but the other side of the game, wow, that would be rough, wouldn't it? But we're in low orbit. We're a little less than 200 miles up, and they need to get to the moon. Now, I did read the sort of play-by-play Wikipedia of several of the Apollo missions that went to the moon, especially 8 and 10 in addition, that went there, never attempted to land, and then came back. They have a firing sequence on the schedule that's supposed to allow them to escape this gigantic marble in space. But I want you to think about it for 1 second here. Every time we see Earth from space, as per a NASA photograph, it is almost categorically always, and I'm unaware if I've seen a photograph that isn't in this, so from my experience, I believe it's 100% of the time. I'm just assuming there's some exceptions to this rule, but it's always in a fisheye lens, every single time, isn't it? The Earth is extremely small looking and super round, but when you start looking at the continents down on this thing, they don't quite look right. They're way too big for the curvature of the Earth, so you know that this thing's being curved. As they are on this supposed space station, they're moving the camera around. The curvature of the Earth is like wonky. It's like constantly changing because the fisheye lens is, in different distort levels. But if you see some of the shots that are of like the hurricanes, or the ground where they're just literally shooting down the one portal, little Han Solo portal window that they put on the space station that only points at the Earth, right? It's a space station, and there's not a portal going up the opposite direction to look at what? Space, right? You wouldn't want to look at the moon, it is by sheer design and sheer priority to avoid looking at space, the thing that they can't simulate easily with a camera, right? If you had a camera and you're like, oh, let's go look at some constellations. What we're going to do is we're going to turn down the lights in these last two modules to get the camera acclimated to low light exposure. We're going to open up the aperture of the camera, and then we're just going to point it out the window at Orion's, Sirius, the North Star, whatever, Polaris. They never do it because creating that level of accuracy would be extremely difficult, and if they so much as pointed it in the wrong way and then back down to Earth through the other portal, you would probably find out that the geometry doesn't work, because the studio in which some of these things are being shot, they can't possibly align everything, right? When they are pointing it directly at the Earth, you start to get an idea of the tiny little speck that we are and the gigantic ball that is the Earth. Again, bubbles in water. That's all you got to remember, guys. Water's ether, the bubble's Earth. That's how it all works. But the Earth is almost 8,000 miles in diameter, 24,000 miles around, thus a 24-hour day. Huge. Huge, huge, huge thing. And we're supposed to be able to start a little tiny engine that, again, you just take the distance of the service module with the lunar module attached to it as it gets into orbit, and then divide it by, find its length, and divide it by the length of the Earth, which is roughly 7,900 miles plus. And that's the percentage of ratio between the two diameters. So starting an engine to escape this gigantic ball is extremely humorous to me. This weird-ass prop plane flies over. Now, they will tell you, and they are rightfully so, that the forces created that are typically known as gravity are a weak force as in relation to everything else that's going on. I would love to do a comparison between just the average gravity field of a particular object and that of which holds the orbital ether matter that makes an atom. There's a tremendous amount of pressure holding an atom together. Those little currents are extremely powerful, but they're also not trying to hang on 100% to the materials that make them. It's a flowing thing. It's a current in a river. The current is just an impression of water doing a little vortex thing, and the water continues down the river. So in terms of holding the energy there, it is holding the vortex of how things work, right? But escaping the Earth's gravity from 200 miles up, which again I think is less than, the atmosphere of the Earth is thinner than the paint on a basketball. I think that's the way my physics teacher taught it. I'm not quite sure if that's technically correct or how that's defined. 200 miles up is a fairly decent, secure lower orbit. But 200 miles up is not a bad altitude, right? It's certainly a conceivable percentage of the Earth's diameter. 800 miles up would be 10%. So we're going down to around 1% or so. A little over percent maybe. So this thing has to fire up, and it's all in the sequences. They say that there's a little engine here, it goes for 5 minutes. This one might go for 17 minutes. But the idea is that this unit is now arbitrarily breaking off from this. Again, you have the slingshot thing. You know, technically speaking, the slingshot theory, when you start off on the body that you're on, and you have to create a larger and larger orbit, this motor would have to fire for a really long time, and the footage of Earth would go far away, close up, far away, close up. It'd be doing this thing. When Buzz Aldrin was shown the photograph, or the movie proof of the leaked reel that went to Bart Sibrel, Sibrel.com, he never said, because the whole thing is stamped in chronological reverse order. The Earth was far away at first, and then it was close up the more they perfected the shot inside the lunar capsule. And he never said, oh, but that's the slingshot. That's what happens with the slingshot. You're going far away, then you're coming back and far away, and we just simply recorded one of those little loops. Nope. NASA back in the day, said that it was a perfectly round orbit, and then poof, you just go to the moon because you just turn on a little motor and you go. It's not going to happen like that. Earth's going to grab you back. You might end up in today's technology creating a massive orbit around Earth. Whether or not you can get it to 237,000 miles out is unknown at this point. But you have to remember, if you start going at the moon and you miss getting an orbit around the moon, theoretically speaking, and again, you're going to have some slingshot thing around the moon too. You can't just get to the moon and go in a nice low orbit the entire time. You're going to have to overshoot it and then come back and all this other stuff. And they never have updated the Apollo mission diagrams to match what's going on with their fake Mars reconnaissance satellites, Jupiter reconnaissance satellites. They've now got the theories down, about how that could work, but they never updated how the moon worked. We never see any animations about them going out and then this closing elliptical orbit around the moon. And isn't it funny that every single orbital thing that goes around Jupiter crashes into Jupiter eventually, right? So stabilizing the orbit once you get to the moon is going to be a bitch. It will be extremely difficult, and you're going to have fuel, and you're going to have to toy with it, especially if you've never been there before. Now, one thing I want to clarify is that we do sort of have the gravity figured out of the moon, but there is a catch. Because we really don't know what the moon is made out of, and we don't know how much it weighs technically. We don't know what it's at its center. They're trying to tell you everything's got nickel iron when it's plasma. The difference between the moon being hollow and the moon having nickel iron center or some sort of hard center, with their theory of phenomenon gravity, which is that atoms communicate with each other and pull each other towards each other, that would drastically change, how we approach an orbit of the moon, potentially. Now, what they do know is how aggressive gravity is. They do understand when we drop things, we know exactly what terminal velocity does, and so we generally can calculate backwards. Well, something that big being held in orbit around Earth it's got to be in this range, because if it was any heavier, it might slam into us. If it's any lighter, it might fly off, or maybe it's lighter, it comes at us, and if it's heavier, it goes away. So for me, I don't have any problem with the mathematics of figuring that out, but I think there's some wiggle room in there that I've never heard discussed. Now, with my theory of ethereal gravity that I picked up off of Eric Dollard, thus all the classical scientists, their thing is that if you have displacement of ether, a big hollow plasma ball in the center of all celestial bodies, it doesn't matter how dense it is, as long as it blocks ether, it is exactly like having a hard center. So perhaps that's how the two theories balance themselves out, where one, they can come up with a theory that works on paper, but they're wrong about what is causing it, and we come in with the classic knowledge that Tesla used to create all of his instruments, all of his theories, all of his patents, and it was all ethereal based. Just kind of want to throw that in there. So now we have a service module, which is a little bullet-shaped thing with the little rocket engine on the back. And we're going to stay here for a little while before we get down to the moon's surface. I was going to make a whole episode about just getting to the moon's surface, but I don't think I would have an hour and a half to talk about that. Now, before we go much further than just the service module, okay, there's an old movie made in 1908 called The Excursion to the Moon. It was a silent movie. It was a brilliant movie. In fact, the more that I look at it, the more my mind just blows. But what was the prop that went to the moon, that stuck in the moon's eye? If you remember that, the moon's guy's face. I mean, the utter brilliance of mankind 100 plus years ago so dwarfs today's creativity. It is utterly painful to be awake and realize how fucking stupid we are today. I'm sorry for just the F-bomb, but that's it. We were so creative back in the days, it was ridiculous. We invented whole new eras of art, and that doesn't happen anymore. Today is a bunch of Chinese knockoff crap that, hey, your phone's disposable. Can you imagine if someone told you 40 years ago that your home phone was disposable, that it was only supposed to last 2 years, but it cost $1,500 and you had to pay, $150 a month for it? Just imagine all of you who are 40 or over, those phones that we just had on the walls, the little things with the ringers inside of them, and someone telling you that device is going to run you, $3,000 a year. And 2 years later, you're supposed to buy a brand new one. It's crazy. But anyway, Excursion to the Moon had a bullet-shaped thing that was going to fire out of a cannon. It did. Fires out of a cannon, flies to the moon, hits him in the eye, and he's got this funny ass facial expression of being poked in the eye. And it goes on to, everyone gets off of this, gets out of this capsule, and then comes back home eventually. So isn't it interesting that the creators of this entire endeavor seem to have lifted a theory out of a movie at the time would have been 61 years old. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, 61 years old. Yeah. Based completely on what was possible to film in a silent movie. Seems like that kind of makes sense. Seems like you have to have a little bit of fuel. The back part of this is a two-part thing, right? There's this big sort of cylinder with the engine on it. Then you have the capsule, which is the bullet-shaped part of it. Most of the back part is all fuel to get that engine to push them supposedly out of low orbit, escaping this gigantic 8,000-mile wide ball in space, hauling ass towards another 1,200-mile wide ball 237,000 miles away and moving around the Earth. So you've got to compensate for everything. The moon doesn't just sit there, right? Now, of course, there's a bunch of relative speeds that they can talk about. But once you leave the Earth in the Saturn V rocket, you're gaining a very different orientation to the Earth's surface than all of us that might be staring at a full moon all day long, right? We're rotating and the moon is rotating. And again, there's this complete mystery as to what the hell the moon really is. Go see my episode on the moon. I think it's in season 2. It might be in season 1. But it's the moon is a very mysterious object. No matter how you think about it, we only see one side of the moon, which is astronomically against the odds that there wouldn't be. Now, here's the thing. Some people say, hey, you're just stupid. You don't understand rotational mathematics, blah, blah, blah. 1, I'm not that guy. 2, if there was remotely a tiny speed differential on the rotation of the moon, very slowly over 100 years, let's say, or 1,000 years, it would rotate all the way around slowly so we could see the backside of the moon. No. For the moon's lifetime. And again, supposedly Plato talked about reading books before the moon. Okay, like it didn't exist until suddenly. But this thing is up there, and we only see perfectly one side of the moon. They tell us that our sun is 93 million miles away, yet during a solar eclipse, the moon perfectly blocks out the sun, and I mean perfectly. I had some asshole debate this with me. No, it doesn't. Like, the guy doesn't know what a solar eclipse is, right? When it perfectly lines up, you get a blacked out sky, and then you see the crescent ring pop out of one side. It's a phenomenal experience. I saw this once when I was, I think, 8 years old in Derby, Kansas. It was funny. My mother went jogging and left me at the house. It was like early evening. And this happens, and the whole sky goes dark, and all the neighbors are outside, and everyone's like yelling and screaming and loving it. And my mom got really afraid that I was at home and I might be freaking out. And I was like, man, bring the UFOs. I'm ready. So the moon is a really strange thing. Let's not overlook that. So the surface module looks like the bullet from a movie made in 1908. A little strange. The lunar module is this, I think, in my opinion, almost a design catastrophe. It's a 4-legged spaceship, sorta. And here's what I noticed, okay? Anytime you look at the statues that are sort of celebratorily, commemorating the moment of going to the moon, they're pretty sexy. The limbs are pretty sexy. All of the ridiculous construction that you see in the photographs of these things on the moon are gone. It looks tight. It looks solid. But when you look at the real thing, you start to see shower rods, tent poles, tin foil. You see sheet metal that's not fastened down well. It looked like something made in utter haste, which I don't understand, because the limb was on paper and they built prototypes for nearly half a decade before they ever said they used it on the moon. In fact, the first one was all white and very, very tight in its design. How they got to this thing on the moon, I don't know. Maybe someone looked at it and said, that doesn't look scientific enough. Get out some foil. Get out some flat black metal. Now, interestingly enough, the gentleman who did the hot air balloon thing in the early 30s, who said that the Earth looked like a disc with upturned edges, he tried to perfect a technique where he knew that the sun would be on one side of him, and he needed to make sure that when he was up there floating in his balloon, that he would reflect away the sun so that his capsule wouldn't get super duper hot. And then he absorbed with the black side of the sphere that he was in the darkness of space to keep it warmed up, trying to balance the heat. Now, what ended up occurring was that the thing rotated badly and it didn't work. He couldn't stabilize it. But if you go and look at the other experiments of the couple guys, was it Steve Fawcett and Richard Branson, who went up they managed to stabilize the container of which they were in. Interesting. The limb has a lot of dark stuff around the actual living quarters, which I would assume would absorb light and thus get extremely hot inside. Every single one of you have been in a car with the sun out. And the second that you turn the air conditioner off in Texas or Phoenix, Arizona, or Miami, Florida, or Dubai, it's a matter of seconds before you start to heat up, before the excited atmospheric particles and the agitation of the sun's verbal waves of photons, start to vibrate the car, that it starts to vibrate and you start to get really warm. All right, now you're in this supposed vacuum of space, getting irradiated by the sun. You have no Van Allen belt to protect you. You have no atmosphere to protect you. Remember, water is an amazing insulator against radiation. So is lead, so is cement. So while we're sitting here underneath this blue sky, we have a lot of fluid between us and outer space. Again, the greenhouse gas layer index, of which attributes and accounts for all warming of this planet after the sun sends over its rays, is 99.99999% water. The amount of CO2 in there is, again, 0.054% of a single percent. So this whole climate change, global warming thing, it's just complete scientific horseshit. Okay. So without all that insulation, the lethal amount of radiation coming off the sun would kill all the astronauts in the capsule that is only a 1/4 inch aluminum. 1/4 inch, people. Now that's being just in space where everything is flowing by your ship. Now I want you to land on a big giant reflector called the moon's surface. And not only are you getting hit by it in your spacesuit, which is just cloth and rubber, but it's coming back off the ground and hitting you twice. And it's probably lost a little bit of its concussive power, but any of you who've skied, when the first time I skied at 13, snow skied, I was brown when I came home. But where my goggles were, I was pure white because you get suntan off the sun in general, but off the snow. All right. All this applies in space too, man. So here they are flying with this bizarre barnacle on the front. And again, there's no problem with aerodynamics once they get out of the atmosphere of the Earth. You have this weird thing on the end. Now, the Van Allen belts, which have been verified as extremely lethal, start at 1,000 miles up, then they're 25,000 miles thick, and then they pretty much taper off, and it goes back to the vacuum of space, which is not a vacuum. It's full of ethereal particles and dust and all kinds of crap. But that 1998 article that Bart Sibrel put in his movie, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, which you should get a signed copy of at Sibrel.com. The lead-in, I've mentioned this several times, but I want you to be able to remember this as well. The lead-in article title was, NASA says something to the fact that NASA says that the Van Allen belts are more lethal than they previously thought. And where did they come up with this? There was a space shuttle mission, which I think has been scrubbed from the history books, as well as that article has been scrubbed, that astronauts went up over 400 miles inside the space shuttle, and everyone started seeing shooting stars with their eyes closed. How did they do that? Well, because the radiation would be going through the hull of the space shuttle, through their helmets, if they have any on, but definitely through their skulls, hitting their rods and cones in their eyes, and then boom, you start to see things. They also reported people getting sick. They have to descend 100 miles roughly in orbit. As I read through it way back in the day, everybody got sick. Then they brought the mission home. I tried to find that mission in 98. I couldn't find anything like that. I couldn't find anything that high up. And I couldn't find any anomalies in any missions in 98. So getting through the Van Allen belts will always be the bane of our attempt to try and enter space. We will need to create a ship that is capable of keeping the electromagnetic field of the Van Allen belts on the outside of the ship. Again, as I suggested in my Making a UFO episode, create a nano-based fiber that acts as a Faraday cage, and then we could not only drive through the Van Allen belts, but we could route that energy down inside engines that we could then use to perhaps do anti-gravity or whatever. But that's just fantasy now, isn't it? So here we are. Let's just say we throw them this ridiculous bone that they can get out of orbit of Earth through some slingshot technique of which they have no fuel to actually accomplish, to create the appropriate amount of force to leave the Earth's gravitational force, right? And let's say for the very first time in Apollo 8 especially, they have this thing down pat the very first time. Here comes this service module screaming towards the moon, perfectly get it in orbit, right? And now they're in this slingshot orbit. And again, we have to give you the 69 slingshot orbit, which is immediately perfect. There's no descending orbits like every other slingshot theory in Hollywood and in their Hollywood, Mars, and Jupiter and Saturn stuff. Okay. So let's just give them all those impossibilities. Now you've got this limb thing attached to the service module capsule. And there's a little door between the two right out of the top. And supposedly, by the way, there's an inner cone inside the cone, which is where all the parachutes are packed, such that when they come home, this space that is probably smaller than a couple suitcases that you might take to the airport with your goods, they are packing 3 of the biggest parachutes you've ever seen in your life. Supposedly packed down to the density of tree bark, and somehow they can just throw it outside and it'll turn into a parachute. Completely, utterly absurd, but whatever. Now we have this thing in Apollo 11. First time it's ever been done. They detach, the 2 astronauts climb over. In this particular case, it'd be Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong. They're crawling through this little tiny aperture, again, with their spacesuits on, which makes them nearly 3 feet thick. The hatch isn't big enough to fit them, but they're doing it anyway. Maybe they went over naked and then, kind of stuffed the backpack through the hole, whatever. Put everything back on. It's not the way it's portrayed in the history books. Okay, so they climb through this hole. Now it's time to disengage from the service module and get down to the moon. Okay. So what's actually occurring here? We are talking about landing in an area with no atmosphere. We're going to use rockets in a non-atmospheric world. The amount of folks coming out of their college degrees with scientific backgrounds saying there's no way that a rocket can work in space, in a vacuum of space, is growing exponentially. There's a lot of you in the comments section, and I am now gravitating that way myself. But again, let's give them their fantasy physics. Little tiny, cone retro rocket things. They're starting to push this thing down. So they've detached and they've retro rocketed this thing to turn. And it's different than being in low orbit of Earth. It is different than just being in low orbit of Earth. We're now way out there in a body in space that has no atmosphere whatsoever. If it did, us looking at the moon would have a completely different experience. It'd be distorted. It'd have a color hue. It'd be a different thing. It rotates, and then it starts puff, 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 pushing itself down. But it's also hauling mega ass. That's the other huge problem. How many times have you seen the footage of the moon's surface skimming underneath these vehicles from Apollo 11 all the way up to Apollo 17? It's moving quick, man. How many of you have been driving your car at 60 miles an hour and you look out over the hood of your car and you're thinking to yourself, that doesn't look like I'm going that fast? Then you look out your window and you're like, holy shit, if I fell out of this car at 60, I'd be human pate on the highway. Well, let me just remind you, this limb is going way, way faster than that from a horizontal standpoint. But how's the limb designed? Well, it's got these retro rocket things which can change its orientation. It has supposedly a 10,000 pound thrust cone at the bottom / engine, which has been miniaturized from all the other engines that we've seen. Again, if you take an average F1 Rocketdyne booster, or even back to the J2, the combustion system that goes over the cone is so huge that it would penetrate the living quarters of the actual limb itself. And supposedly with, all I can say is we were racing to get this thing to work properly and to work in a way that it wouldn't eventually explode, to the extent that it could use the amount of fuel that we could ferry, in the fuselage of I guess that's what you call it, of the rocket itself, to make it economical to get it into space. We have this magic 10,000 pound thrust engine. But what's that thing going to do? Well, if you played that old video game, Lunar Lander, where you have a lunar module and it's just tilting back and forth and tilting back and forth, you are now tilting, I guess, in the direction that you're going horizontally to try and slow the damn thing down so that the ground starts moving around 0 miles an hour. What you want to be in is damn near geocentric orbit with this moon surface, but only, a few feet off the ground until you land. There is test footage inside of an office where they had built a sand pit, and they had a model of this limb on a pulley, and they kept dropping it and dropping it and dropping it, and every time they did it, it rolled over. They tried 5 legs, they tried 4 legs, they eventually settled on 4. You'd think 5 would be better, but somehow they settled on 4. And this thing gets big after a while, right? The thing gets huge. In the real world, they've been trying to fly something like this over a parking lot, crashes and burns every single time. Never saw it function properly before we landed on the moon. That's a nice little piece of trivia. As a matter of fact, NASA tried up until, I think, a decade and a half ago to do what SpaceX did perfect on the first try, which is supposedly land these boosters back down on the rocket pads. Again, none of us mortal human beings are invited to see that live. So that's fake until any of us see it live. And I don't give a shit what's on YouTube. If one of us doesn't see it that you can trust, it ain't happening. But you're in the vacuum of space, and now you're blowing a bunch of fire out of a cone. And supposedly the moon gives a shit about the force that you're exerting on yourself in space. That's why people think rockets don't work in the vacuum of space. So you're pushing on yourself. That's great. Relative to what? How are you able to adjust your relative speed in space by just blowing a bunch of fire out of the bottom of a cone? The theory is that the fire is pushing on the cone, and so you're kind of doing it that way. Maybe that works. I would certainly not like to be Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong and find out that that isn't the case on the very first try. But they have to make up a lot of speed. They have to then perfectly match this descent rate, and their forward momentum. And I never saw anything that claimed that the lunar module was sideways, trying to, reduce its overall horizontal speed. Perhaps that's the way it worked. I never saw that in any animation. Matter of fact, the animation, the footage that they submit to us of this thing going down to the moon is extremely uniform and perpendicular to the ground, so that the tripod legs, or the quadruped legs, are perpendicular with the surface of the moon as it goes down. Maybe they did this big turn thing and started firing, like the Lunar Module video game. Okay, or Lunar Lander video game. Now, there's a bunch of drama around the landing on the moon, which is that this computer that's on board, using this rope memory, which has got to be some of the most wildly conceived stuff on planet Earth. Apparently it works, otherwise they wouldn't have made it. If you see the factory floor of them building this rope memory, your brain starts to hurt at how they ended up trying to use coiled wires through this lattice of beams to distinguish a positive and a negative inside of a binary computer. I didn't hear until, in the last 2 years, that this idea that as the lunar module is coming down to land, it must use computer-controlled retros and stuff to make this all take place. And it essentially removes the human element, right? Neil Armstrong or Buzz holding a joystick and controlling things, they don't really have to do much because the computer has to do it. And a few seconds before actual impact with the surface of the moon, according to the official story, the computer crashed. But the computer was designed to reboot immediately, and because there's not much to it, it reboots fairly quickly, and it managed to save the day at the end. So they take this very skeptical computer design and they make it a hero so that you don't analyze it anymore. Well, the computer's a hero. If the computer didn't work, everybody would have died. That's why it's totally real. Oh, okay, and there's aliens on the moon, which makes your landings totally real. So I have a big problem with the landing on the moon. The actual moment that was captured on film, supposedly out the window, to the lunar module on the surface of this studio in Hollywood, right? Or Groom Lake, or wherever the hell they filmed this thing. The little pads that are covered with all this wild copper foil have not a single speck of dust on them. But as you watch the footage of them landing on the moon, you start to see metric tons of dust flying around this window, right? Or outside the window. Now, do you realize that if this thing were even going 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, it's going to do what that prototype did in the office? It's going to roll over. It's going to dig in its heels and it's going to roll over. But you saw it land, supposedly, in this footage, right? It did bump when it hit. And it would bump. Now, one of our listeners claimed that there are these steel boxes that were designed to crush as soon as it hit the moon's surface. If that's the case, that's ingenious. That's a great idea. And that will definitely subdue the impact. But what is it actually going to subdue? It's going to subdue the impact above the box. The legs below the box are still going to dig into the ground. They're still going to go bump, 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 right? Given that they knew that the moon's surface is not flat by any stretch of the imagination, the Sea of Tranquility and that kind of stuff appears to be a lot smoother than the rest of the stuff. But what if one leg hit a little spire of a rock, right? It's like a iceberg. Down below, it's a rock the size of New York State, but up above, it's just a little tiny 10-inch rock. So if a leg had hit that, you would be on your side in 2 seconds. So many of the other landing zones, 12, 14 through 17, had incredibly hostile surfaces that they landed next to. In fact, one of them, lands, I can't remember exactly which one, but there's one where it landed very, very close to a boulder that was about the size of a small bus. Can you imagine? Can you imagine landing next to something that unmovable? You would destroy your vehicle, and you would destroy your vehicle in a way that you're not going home. And here's the thing. How did they get home after they've done their giant, 4-day, 5-day stay on the surface of the moon plus, right? That lunar module has to be perfect, pointing straight up, because they're going to blast this dynamite or whatever underneath the thing, and it's going to go straight up in the air. If it is off by a fraction of a degree, you are no longer going to ever rendezvous with the service module, and that alone should give you proof that this whole thing is completely and utterly ridiculous. The amount of utter perfection and perfectness of all things has to be 100%. Otherwise, this isn't going to occur. But let's just keep going with their fantasy. Supposedly, they're able to use this rocket engine in space. And unless, again, they turn against their vector, their differential between their speed and the speed of the surface of the moon. And I know what people are going to think. Well, they were in geocentric orbit anyway. Right. Let's add another whole layer of cake of complete and utter impossibility that from Earth, they're going towards the moon and to get in this perfect orbit with the moon. Hey, the thing faces us all year round. So you're going to have to basically come to a standstill in space to get this thing to work. But no, the service module's still going in orbit around the moon, so it can't be that geocentric, you know. So it separates. It does this maneuver that no one could have ever tested on Earth in 1969 or before, where they're retro-rocketing down, slow themselves down, and land. Miraculously, in the 6 missions that succeeded supposedly in touching the moon surface, not a single speck of dust ever got on those feet. Every single time. Utter and complete perfection. Right. What on earth have we ever done with, I don't know, 1,000th of the complexity happens perfect every time? Does a kicker in the NFL have the ability to kick 2 balls through a goal the same exact way? Does a hockey guy have the ability to knock a puck into a goal the same exact way every single time? Do you drive to work and stay in the perfect lane every single time? Never. You're never able to replicate this utter and complete perfection with the variables that are those events. But according to NASA, no problem. Every single time. In fact, if you go look up the LIM, the lunar module on Wikipedia, it has this little scorecard off to the right. Fails, 0. Lost, 0. Perfect. Utterly perfect. Well, gee, Hollywood is pretty awesome, isn't it? It's like watching one of those Hollywood movies where, you know, a basketball team comes from behind and takes over and wins the championship. Even they don't write that level of perfection in movies because the audience would go, bullshit, right? Not NASA. Not NASA. So, these astronauts are sitting there, and they're inside again this compartment. There's all these, if you look at the diagrams and the cross sections of it, there's all these circular things, both at the level that they're at and downstairs, and that is going to account for all the water that they need to drink, all the food they need to eat, all the waste products they need to process, and all the oxygen they need to breathe. Again, if you're a deep sea diver, tell me how many tanks you got to take to last 24 hours a day for, I think the last mission, you know, being 12 and a half days. I don't know. I mean, how many days they're going to spend on the moon? There may be a couple days to get there, a couple days to get back. And so you subtract out, you're talking 6 to 8 days of oxygen. Food, I don't really worry about too much. But they're in these spacesuits that are inflated. Well, we have plenty of footage of them testing out in water, testing out on land, being on these sort of bungee cord things to somehow simulate the weightlessness on the moon. They're approximately 3 feet wide when this thing is completely inflated. And they also have a 100-pound backpack that supposedly has their oxygen supply for whatever mission they're going to do outside the LIM's capsule. The LIM itself is, again, sitting on the surface of the moon, that if we use NASA's official storyline, when hit by the sun in the vacuum of space, you can reach up to 280 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the shadow, you immediately drop to 250 degrees below Fahrenheit, below 0. All right, how does anything survive that differential in heat? Talking about a 500 degree swing in heat. Well, I mean, I don't know about you. I've sat in a car in 114 degrees in Havasu with the air conditioner attempting to keep me cool. I'm still sweating my ass off, and it's only 115 outside. I'm sure that the moon has got dry heat, right? But 280? Let's just say 200. The amount of excited particles hitting the metal on the outside, yeah, I'm sure there's some theoretical insulation you could put in there. But reflecting all that agitation away from the center living quarters, impossible. One of you guys chimed in And in fact, two people have chimed in who work with air conditioning. But there was a very vivid example. Someone said they were tasked with cooling off a room that was 160 degrees on average. And they said the amount of power that they needed to do that was horrendous. The amount of electricity consumed to generate that air conditioning was horrendous. Okay. But they did it on the moon, no problem, with battery technology. I bet Elon Musk would love to get a hold of the battery technology in the Apollo 11 so that, when you fill a whole chassis with batteries from Apollo 11, you can drive for fucking 12 years without pulling over to recharge. In fact, based on the Apollo 11 lunar module, Elon Musk could create his own oxygen supply center in the car too, so you wouldn't have to breathe pollution from outside filtered through some filter. Nope, you could have your own atmosphere inside his cars if you had just the technology from 1969. Hell, you don't even need the computers that are 4 or 5 million times more powerful than the computer in the Apollo lunar module, because they had rope memory, and man, rope memory is something else, boy. I hope the absurdity of this whole thing just starts to sink in and sink in and sink in. So I can't remember what astronaut's nephew went to the museum in, I believe, Florida. But he was on video. He was trying to film himself examining the lunar module replicant that was in the museum, a 1-to-1 replicant. And he was VIP'd all over the place because he's the nephew of an astronaut, a living, breathing moon astronaut. But he brought a little tiny tape measure with him, and when he said, you mind if I measure the portal door? He was kicked out of the museum immediately. Why? Because that little door is not wide enough to let an astronaut in a spacesuit that's inflated get out the door. Apparently my show is so alluring that everyone wrecks their car during every episode. Now, someone might offer some stupid theory, well, they don't inflate till they get outside. There's not a single piece of footage of an astronaut coming through the portal door, meaning part of their body's on the inside and part of their body's on the outside, because they can't fit through the door. It's Hollywood, man. If we had that problem on a Hollywood set, and any one of you had the naivete to complain about such a thing, the director would look at you and go, this is Hollywood, man. It's just there as a prop. But when you claim, $150 billion of development to create this program, taking it from taxpayer dollars, and again, the LIM was $21 billion in development in today's money, about $2.2 billion in 1960s money. That's a lot of dough, man. It matters. It matters when they lie. So again, these guys are climbing out. Their suits are made of cloth and rubber. A little bit of metal for supposedly these rubber seals that work in space, right? A rubber seal in the vacuum of space, where one side of the metal brace around the helmet's going to be 280 and the other half's going to be below 280 Fahrenheit. You got a major problem with your O-ring that's keeping these guys from dying from the outer atmosphere leaking into their suit. As well, I am unaware of any rubber cloth suit that can withstand 280 degrees Fahrenheit for a moment's notice, right? Think about all these firefighters that we just heard jumping into a fire, and they've got all kinds of fire retardant materials on them. Yeah, they can take a burst of a flame for a really short period of time. Think about the Formula One racers, or anyone who does racing. There's different grades of your suit to handle different grades of fire based on different grades of fuel. I think the most expensive suit you can buy, from a friend of mine who races Baja, he told me the most expensive suit you can buy gives you about 10 seconds of fire before you're going to start feeling it and start suffering cellular damage, right? Now, 280 is not fire, but I think 320 is the basic fire our basic temperature required to get a match to ignite its fuel on the end of the stick. All right. So we're really hot, man. We are super duper hot. And part of insulating any body from a surface so that you don't feel what's happening with the surface is there has to be a little bit of space between you and the surface that is encountering this undeniable heat. And so, like the space shuttle tiles, there are these ceramic tiles on the outside of a hull that's pretty damn thick, and then you don't sit with your body up against the hull. So even if the hull was a little bit warm, it's like the SR-71 pilots that said the capsule window is so hot you could throw an egg at it and it burns up completely before it hits you in the lap. If they touch that, they're going to be in a big, big trouble. So what's the difference between wearing the suit that is enduring these drastic cold and heat levels? Remember, hypothermia starts around 60 degrees. I think it's even like 67 degrees, right? One of our listeners chimed in, and because I think it's a he, followed the testing of these suits in the California deserts. And they said that they were never able to get these suits to work, and that the astronauts started passing out in these suits in the desert. They said the desert was about 135, but the suits started getting up to about 160 degrees. That's death, man. That's complete and utter death. And just because the back might be negative 160 or negative 130, it doesn't fix the problem inside. You're a cooked egg on one side of your body, and you're an icicle on the back of your body. And no 100-pound backpack has been developed to provide oxygen. That's the first thing that needs to exist on the backpack of this thing, is just a supply of oxygen, let alone an air conditioner, let alone the ability for this stuff to get out to your fingertips, to your tip of your toes, to the top of your head. I mean, the helmet's actually pretty suited for this, but your entire body, you would need a distance of some level. Even with space-age stuff from the 21st century or the 24th century, you would need some distance between just the suit and your flesh. Otherwise, this is going to cook you or freeze you. It just will. If you look at the gloves that they had, they're rubber-tip gloves. Look at the booties they put on before they go out, which creates the little slats when they step on the moon soil. They have smooth leather soles. They go into these grippy little boots. Okay, what rubber today can withstand days and days and days of 280 degrees Fahrenheit without melting? Go try it. Go take your oven, throw it up to 280 degrees. Find some dense rubber and put it in the oven and just let it sit for hours and hours and hours, and tell me that you're going to be not smelling a house full of a toxic chemical that'll kill you. In fact, don't do that. You'll probably die. It's only okay for astronauts from the 60s. All right. Now, for those of you that are really intense enthusiasts and you're willing to watch every single reel that NASA has offered us, claiming that they have videotaped astronauts on the moon, you need to go through 11, 12, 14, 16, 17. The later missions started getting pretty silly. But you will find tons of gravity anomalies, tons of sound anomalies. There's a famous scene where, I believe it's Buzz, but I could be wrong. Here they are in the vacuum of space, meaning sound waves are never going to travel because there's nothing to make them travel. Now, if someone walks up to you in the vacuum of space and taps your helmet, you're going to hear it because you have oxygen in your helmet. The concussion from outside will vibrate in, go into your ear, and you'll hear sound. But there's a famous scene where someone threw something away, and it hit the leg, I believe is where it impacted, and you could hear it in the microphone. That means it made a big tick noise, and it went through the oxygenated room / studio where this is all occurring, and you hear it inside the spacesuit, and there you go. You're not on the moon anymore. You're in a studio. So some of you might be saying, okay, we'll get to how they actually faked this thing. And again, I got a whole episode that's all about this, how they faked it. But just really quickly, they dropped a limb down on the set with a crane, which is why the legs never have any scoot, which is what's been filmed out the window. They never have any dirt on them. And there you go. It also doesn't have to perform anything in the vacuum of space. It's just there. Clean as a whistle, right? Not that we get a lot of dirt, but the legs are going to definitely get filthy. The astronauts are on this set. In fact, it's not even the astronauts, in my opinion. I think it's agents, actors pretending to be these folks. That's why they have a blast shield in front of them that's covered in gold. The theory is that it reflects a lot of the light from the sun. At the same time, anytime you reflect light away from a surface, you're talking about just looking at the ground becomes difficult. You're looking through a welding mask of some sort, right? But they are also on wires. Okay, old as the hills, man. I don't know what the first stage performance was in history where someone was on a wire. I would assume it's back in the Greek theater days. But they realized that, back in the 1800s, if you're on a black wire against a black curtain, it's a little harder to see it. If you keep the audience down looking up at it, it's even better. So what do they do to make sure that we couldn't see these black wires? And there may be footage where they don't actually use the wires, but I would personally guess that they were on wires the entire time. Well, they get rid of all the stars. Because the stars are one thing they can't fake in a studio. Because why? Well, the studio's not a gigantic dome, it's a square box. If you're trying to paint the perspective of how stars are painted in space, well, you're definitely going to see things vanish into a flat plane, turn a corner, and come at you. It's going to look awful. So they used the excuse that they couldn't see any stars because the cameras were dialed in to see this massively reflective ground, and therefore you can't see stars. Now, in most cases, I would agree with them. That's true. Couple things. Sirius is a bright-ass star in the space, okay? Super bright. Brightest star in the skies, as I've been told, okay? That we can see with the human eye from Earth. That might show up. But two, I think you owe it to the American people and the world that while you're there, you adjust the aperture of the camera. And you keep it from ever pointing at the moon's surface, right? You keep it up, and you do point it at the stars, and you go, check this out. Boom. None of that. None of that at all. Now, I used to say this. Someone has circulated this footage, and I don't think it looks real personally. But they've circulated this weird video of moon coverage, and it's making this claim, oh, this is the footage that proves we didn't go to the moon. I watched it a couple times. I couldn't figure out what the hell they were talking about. Didn't have time to read any articles around it. I don't think there were any articles around it because someone linked me the video directly. But they did show someone filming on the moon's surface and then filming this half moon thing of the Earth far away, and it's pure white. The big sort of gotcha with being on the moon for 6 successful missions is that in using a video camera constantly in this process, there's no clear shot, I will say, other than this weird piece of footage which looks fake, but anyway, of taking the camera, the video camera, and turning it and pointing it at the Earth. Video. It's very important. Still photographs, well, they razor blade negatives together and take one shot of 2 negatives on top of each other, and that's how you get the half marble shot that you see. But once someone took that photo off NASA's website from a long time ago in the 90s and high-conned it, basically took it in Photoshop and jacked up the contrast, you see this perfect rectangle around the Earth because it's been cut in from a different negative. It changes the density of black when you do that, and therefore they saw the forgery in the photograph. And then you have this hoppity-hop, 1/6 gravity jumping around the moon thing. Now, it's easy to take the equation and simply say, oh, well, we just take the rate of fall and we also diminish it by 1/6, and so you're going to have 1/6 speed on everything. The problem with that, as we all know who are on the inside of this whole thing, is that when you take any of the moon footage where they appear to be hopping around on the moon and floating for a microsecond here and there, and you crank it to 2x, the whole thing seems real time all of a sudden. Well, for those of you who want to try to debunk the whole thing, because I think you're not going to have any of that floaty stuff. You're going to weigh about 50 pounds roughly, and a child doesn't float because they weigh 50 pounds on Earth. A cat doesn't swim around your house weighing less than 50 pounds. You weigh 50 pounds. That's it. Rate of descent? Bullshit. But whatever. I should have to take that footage and crank it up 6x to see this thing go remotely real time in terms of the way that things drop. Nope, 2x does the trick. It's an old Hollywood thing. It's called overcranking the camera. 24 frames a second establishes motion in a movie theater. Okay, so you roll it at 48 frames per second, then you play it back at 24 frames per second, and you have exactly the effect that you see in all the footage. Now, for those of you who might have been alive during this, my co-host from the other show said he remembered it because he was like 9 years old when it occurred. He said that they kept saying over and over and over again in Apollo 11, Apollo 12, I think 13, 14, that this Saturn V rocket with its Rocketdyne F1 boosters down below was so perfectly arranged internally that the saying that he remembered was they couldn't take up another paperclip because it would off balance the rocket and it would make it. Now, obviously that's an exaggeration. It's not a literal statement from NASA, but I'm sure that that was said. What they're talking about is you can't bring up a lot of heavy stuff in addition to everything else they're bringing. But by Apollo 15, they bring up a 700-pound car. Okay, so where are the improvements? What did you take out of the rocket to make this occur? The reason why they brought a car up in Apollo 15 is, again, everyone's getting bored as hell. Think about the arc of interest in these moon missions. Obviously, 11 is a landmark moment for mankind if everyone's believing the hoax. By 12, people were calling in, like Bart Zabrell said, and complaining that this was interfering with their normal television programming. Again, the classic complaint was I Love Lucy was the most popular television show in America, and they were complaining that that was being wiped off the networks to cover the spoon stuff. So they develop a little, tragedy, which is the Apollo 13. There's an explosion outside the service module. It's never explained. There's only one paragraph in the official report trying to allude to what might have occurred, but even that stays away from any specifics, because if there was something that could explode on the outside at such an early stage in the rocket, they would have to redesign the whole surface module. If it was like, well, shit, we forgot, there's this oxygen tube that goes next to the power coupling, and then poof, that gets a little too hot and explodes. Nope. So everyone's interested in 14 because 13 almost, and according to the fake story, they almost died. All of them. So everyone's going to watch 14. Probably still got bored by the time it was over. So now, instead of waiting for the public to get bored, they inject a new space thing, right? The moon buggy. So someone else uncovered this, and I started watching it, and I got a lot of kudos for my moon evidence video for putting this in there. But someone realized very quickly that this moon buggy, which is based on a Jeep chassis, had a dummy in it the entire time. Wasn't a human being. At no point in the moon buggy footage do you have someone independently moving. Now, these guys were goofing off on the moon to a degree that was ridiculous. Again, they were singing songs and playing golf by the Apollo 17 mission. They were doing all kinds of wild stuff. So these guys aren't, they would be giddy to be on the moon, wouldn't they? I would be. So you're driving this car on the moon for the first time. Peace, man. Hey, Mom. How's it going? Hey, buddy over there. I'm driving this car. The way that it was arranged was that one of the dummy's hands was on the wheel. The other hand's just sitting there floating as this thing's bouncing around, right? Now, you and I might drive, in fact, almost all of you have ridden on an ATV. You've ridden on amusement park rides that are very violent here and there. And we do something as human beings because it's a natural thing. For those of you ever seen someone hold a chicken and it starts staring at the video camera and they move the body of the chicken but the head just stays absolutely still. All birds do this, and we do this as well. You correct with your muscle tissue to keep from being thrown around inside of a vehicle. You're still going to get thrown around, but you attempt to fight it, and you would be very sore after riding on one of those things because, one, I'm sure that the suspension was pretty raw, even though the tires, this vehicle is ingenious. I mean, whoever designed this thing was just next level thinking. It was great. This whole thing is fairly next level thinking. So there's some awards that we should give to people for coming up with this, and then there's some jail cells that should have been filled up a long time ago for other people. Least of all the astronauts. I mean, the astronauts were forced into doing this, okay? But if you watch the moon buggy footage, it's a joke. And then we have folks that drive dune buggies in the desert. And they are very familiar with the rooster tail that comes off the back of tires in our gravity world. 1/6 gravity means that the plume coming off the back of this thing would have been a dirt road nightmare. You would be, any of you who've lived in the Midwest, you've driven down a dirt road, you can see someone coming from miles away because you start to see that Robbie the Robot, dirt trail that comes off the back of the truck. And again, it's one of those funny things that you don't want to stop the truck at a stop sign because that cloud's going to roll over your truck and your tow truck's going to be brown, right? Not the problem with the 1/6 gravity moon buggy. And again, supposedly, the surface of the moon has no water, so this stuff would be the most pure, concentrated powder, whatever the hell the moon's made out of, right? But again, they ran at 2x, and all of a sudden, all the gravity is 1/1 gravity here on Earth. Big problem. Now, in terms of the theory of bringing back moon rocks, that really isn't a problem, to be honest. Especially if you could fit the Chrysler in the bottom. They said, I believe the number is that in all the missions that went to the moon, I think the total number of rocks is about 600 pounds, which means coming back at any one point in time, 6 successful missions, on average, we'd have 100 pounds of rocks coming back. Yeah, whatever. I think that works. If you had 1/6 gravity, you have these big explosive bolts that blow that thing up into the atmosphere, up into the higher altitudes, no atmosphere. It's theoretical. You could do it. Now, all the moon rocks are from Earth. They went down to the South Pole and picked up a bunch of rocks on the snow, which are probably meteorites of some sort. So when they study the quantum frequency of these rocks, they do appear to be outside this world. But then go look at all the embalming tools that the Egyptians used. They took iron ore out of meteorites, melted it down, and made all the embalming equipment. So you could look at those tools and say, wow, these tools are from outside the world. These must be aliens and all that stuff. No, it's just iron ore meteorites, okay? There's clubs that go look for this stuff in the desert all the time. So for anyone denying that exists, you got a lot of explaining to do, right? So what else is on the moon that seems a little weird if all this is still plausible for someone's brain? Well, one of the two astronauts has a Hasselblad camera attached to their chest with no ability to look down through the viewfinder. In fact, there is no viewfinder because there doesn't need to be one. Yours truly grew up with Hasselblads my entire life until I left home. So I've had a Hasselblad in my hand as a child whenever I wanted one, and when my father, who was a professional photographer, would take me out on wedding shoots or whatever we were shooting, the back of the camera comes off. You have to put this little aluminum slider thing in there, and then you can pull the back off. It won't expose the film because it's protected by the slide that went in there. And then I've already got the new back with the brand new, I think it's like 120 film or whatever. It's a huge square negative, and he just slides the new one on. He doesn't miss a beat. I take the new one, crank it out, pull out the film because it's now inside the canister, reload the new one, get it ready for him when he comes back to me. Okay. Hasselblads are delicate cameras that when I was a kid, the rumor was that it takes a year to make one. It's like a Swiss watch. Okay. Well, they don't they don't give an astronaut the exact ones that we have here on Earth, right? If any of you have seen it, it's a pretty metallized camera. They take out all the black leather or plastic or anything that's going to be unnecessary for decoration reasons, and they made the whole thing out of metal. Now, again, 15 years ago, I watched an interview with a gentleman that made the cameras that went to the moon. He's being interviewed by someone who believes what we believe, which is the whole thing's a hoax. They asked the guy, of the camera that you made, special for NASA, all those cameras that you made, what would happen if you took the camera and exposed it to 280 degrees Fahrenheit and then suddenly slammed it down to 280 degrees below Fahrenheit, below 0 Fahrenheit? The dude had a beat in the script where he just looked at the guys like, what? And like, yeah, that's the environment that your cameras were in. And he said, well, they would explode. Something to that effect. A Hasselblad camera has the most amazing precision in it with Zeiss lenses. I mean, it is a masterpiece. Leica's, same way. Most cameras are pretty amazing devices, right? But a lot of tender pieces inside that have to flex really fast. The shutter's got to go in and out super quick, right? To expose the film to the perfect amount of light through the aperture ASA settings, right? If you started twisting and turning any of that metal, that camera's not going to work. Well, not only did the video cameras work, but the Hasselblads work perfectly. Now, I've had people debate the following thing with me, and they're probably talking about different missions, but the first articles I ever read on Neil Armstrong, this is when I was a believer, about using the Hasselblad camera, because I sort of felt special. I had Hasselblads in my life. Hasselblads went to the moon, and it's a cool thing. They have about 30 frames inside each one of the rolls of film. And I never heard about Neil reloading the camera and shooting multiple rolls of film. Someone recently came into I shouldn't say recently, probably 3 years ago, came into the comments and said that Neil took several rolls of film. So maybe that's the case. I've been unable to verify that. But of the shots that Neil got, they are epic time-life cover photographs. And he had no ability to look through a viewfinder on his chest to see if he was actually framing the shot correctly. The excuse was that he was trained to be a great photographer. Having grown up in that realm myself, and seeing out of all the shots that my father would take by precisely looking down into the viewfinder and holding it, there's still a boatload of shots you would never use. Lighting didn't work out right, someone walked, someone moved, something happens, right? Not for Neil Armstrong. He takes one class and he is the most intuitive photographer on planet Earth. And quite frankly, instead of turning into an alcoholic after he came back from the moon missions, because his soul was probably rotting from lying about this whole thing and having no option otherwise, he should have become a professional photographer. Because imagine Neil looking through the viewfinder. Oh my God, what could that guy possibly do? I mean, he doesn't have to even look. And here's what's funny. If I explain this thing to someone in 1995, well, how'd you take a picture in 1995? You'd say, well, you got to go buy some film, you got to study your ASA rating, and you got to take it, and you got to go take it down to Photomat, and got to get it developed, and then you bring it back, yada, yada, yada. And someone could maybe believe back in 1995 that you could just be told how to take a great photograph, and instantaneously your genetics upgrade, and you have this massive intuition for lighting and all this other stuff. For those of you who've been on a Hollywood set, and I have been on a few, there's a reason why you sit around for 12 hours for your 4-minute take. Because they are working on camera positioning, lighting, taking all kinds of sample shots to make sure the lighting's perfect, looking through previs monitors to make sure it's all good, make sure it's all lined up perfectly. The shots that Neil Armstrong took were so unbelievably perfect. It boggles the mind, to suggest that a guy could do this with a camera on his chest. As I've said in several episodes, if I gave you such a rig and tied it to your chest and said you couldn't look at anything that you're doing, but you have to go to Disneyland and bring out 10 Time Life covers, and I gave you infinite amount of film. It's a digital camera, let's just say. Infinite amount of memory or whatever, but you can't leave the park until you get me 10 Time Life shots. You're going to be there for months, if not years, trying to get 10 shots. No problem for Neil Armstrong. But again, the first thing I ever read was that how astonishing it was that he was able to do this with one roll of film. It doesn't make any sense to me now I think about it, but I definitely remember hearing that claim and seeing the numbers in the article. Don't know. Pretty amazing job he did. But let's talk about radiation. Okay. Radiation in space is very formidable without a coronal mass ejection. Radiation in space in the Van Allen belts is most definitely so powerful that if you took a bunch of human beings and put them in a capsule a quarter-inch thick, you'd be frying these folks like, a peach in a microwave for 4 days, right? They would be so utterly dead and cooked to a crisp, they wouldn't exist to this day. But if you took film and exposed it to radiation in a camera made of aluminum, which does not shield against radiation, you would have the experiment that Madame Curie, the woman who really is credited with discovering radiation from uranium bars, her experiment that led to the discovery. Very quick story. She was constantly using film in her laboratory and dealing with uranium bars. On one night, she put a uranium bar on top of a package of film in a desk drawer, closed it, went away, came back, eventually used that film and found out it was all exposed right where the bar was, because radiation from the bar leaks through the paper, no problem, and exposed the film. So all of Neil Armstrong's footage would have been, if not 100%, probably 1,000% overexposed, completely exposed when he got back to Earth. Same with the video cameras. Even modern day video cameras that are using, LCDs, sensors, the analog to digital conversion, would have the same exact problem. For the same reason astronauts saw shooting stars in their eyes in 1998 when they went 40% the distance to the Van Allen belts is the same reason why the film would have been exposed. Same thing with an LCD. It just feels concussion of light, the verb of light, and it registers light. You just turn the camera on, it's immediately white. It's immediately overexposed. I don't know, maybe you walk behind a rock where there's a shadow and all of a sudden you could see something in it because it's being blocked by the rock. Don't know. Now, Bart Sobral mentions this several times, and I don't go for this, but this is his go-to thing, so I want to mention it here. His big piece of evidence is that the shadows on the moon converge. And they converge violently, not casually. So you will have a shot of the limb in sunlight. For those of you who are good with Photoshop, you'll take any one of the moon photographs and you high-con any shot, and you start seeing hot spots. Well, I'm in a backyard right now, and there's no hot spots of any kind, except maybe on my forehead right here. But without shadows, you don't get hot spots because the sun is far enough away, however far that is, and it creates uniform light wherever there's daytime. Even when it's dusk, it's uniform dusk. You don't get hot spots. Hot spots are created by what? Ask anybody in Hollywood who's a grip. Spotlights cause hot spots, and they are something that Hollywood fights every single day. I mean, today alone. During the course of me shooting this episode, I'm going to wager that there's been 500 sets somewhere in the world, from Bollywood to Hollywood, where people are trying to get rid of hot spots. Hot spots on actors' faces, hot spots on the ground, because they're trying to simulate light that's natural, and they're using spotlights to do it. So the only way you can do it is introduce more and more lights. I believe it was a Cinema Tyler guy that said that, maybe even Vivian Kubrick told me this, that inside the room at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, where Jack is typing on the, typewriter, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, the number is close to 800 lights in that room. Which sounds ridiculous, but they said the room was so hot that they would have to turn on all the lights, get the shots done quick, and then turn them off because everybody was getting just heat stroke in the room. That's how important it is to distribute light in normal Hollywood. But they didn't do that because they knew they had a singular light issue with the sun. So there's been some theories that they put giant arrays of light bulbs together to create this giant impression of the sun. But Bard has some very convincing footage of, again, rocks that have 90-degree shadows with the foreground objects going straight out. So they converge at a 90-degree angle just 100 feet out. Now, the excuse for that is that the moon's surface is not uniform in its ups and downs, and so you could get some of those weird shadows. I don't think that remotely addresses the issue. You would simply have the shadows going in that direction, perhaps being a little bit off in vector, but definitely not a 90-degree turn. And there's tons of photographs that reveal this. I once showed the famous picture of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder, which NVIDIA did a pathetic fucking attempt to try to debunk. And again, the photo that they have in their simulation online negates what we're seeing in the photograph. So they just erased the evidence and said, look, it's Buzz coming down the thing, and it's just reflective light off the surface of the moon. But the idea is that Buzz is coming down the back of the limb on a ladder in the shadows, but he's fully lit, and he has hot spots on his cloth of his leg. He's got hot spots on the rubber seal of his foot, and the whole thing's lit. The whole thing is lit beautifully. And again, of course, Neil Armstrong gets a Time Life cover shot with one try. It's beautiful, right? No coverage for Neil, man. He just boom, perfection, right? But I showed that picture to a friend of mine who worked for Blizzard Entertainment. He was one of the most senior guys in their cinematics department when they were booming. I showed it to him in 2014. He had never considered for a second that the moon missions weren't real. He just doesn't care, which I think is funny. And he looked at the shot and he goes, he's listening to me tell him, that things aren't real. And he just says, well, I can tell you right now, I can see with my eye 5 different light sources for this shot. And I said, really? And he goes, yeah. And he goes, there. He saw a bunch of stuff I didn't see. Because Blizzard Entertainment Cinematics Group back in the day were the best digital eyes on planet Earth. These guys learned how photons fly around environments. That's what they do. They have a term internally they call pixel fucking, which is that they will take 5 seconds of footage and mull over it for 6 weeks to make sure it's absolutely pixel perfect. Now, I've got plenty of guys in Hollywood that have big gold statues that have told me the same exact thing, or some variation thereof, that once they had someone crack it in their brain, oh yeah, this thing could be fake, and yeah, that doesn't make any sense, and da-da-da. They came back to me, and over drinks, they just simply shook their head. They're in their 70s and 60s, and they're like, I can't believe I believed this was real for all that time. Unbelievable. Now, there's some footage out there that's kind of interesting. We're going to wrap this up before we take off back to the Earth. That, because we are discovering this is a fake, some people have created bogus footage of, lights falling down from the ceiling and astronauts going, what the hell, man? They've created deliberate fakes to create disinformation so that you believe that people are faking some of this stuff. But everything I've told you so far is just straight up use your brain and you're going to be on top of the real story. I believe it was 15, 16, or 17, somewhere in there, there's this piece of footage which shows a worker on the set picking up a piece of trash and taking it off the set. And he's obviously dressed in pedestrian clothing, and he walks off set. Someone said that they faked that shot. I would say that they did a brilliant job because they created a government reel that still had the shadow in the shot, and someone took advantage of that shadow to put a guy in there. Whether or not that's true or not, I would say you don't need any of that sort of stuff to convince yourself that this is not possible, for all the reasons cited in this episode. Now, the other one is I just want to mention quickly to kind of maybe put in a maybe. I have been citing for all the episodes that I get into this, the sheath that seems to be underneath the limb right after they land on Apollo 11. It was billed as a sheath around the 10,000-pound thrust motor, which is then blown off as it's doing its landing, and it happens to be right underneath the limb, unburned, no dirt on it, and of course it would have come off miles away. And so what is it doing underneath the limb? Someone recently posted that they were told that was a bag of rubbish. Now, I just did a deep dive into the limb and looked at a ton of photographs. There are, apparently, I saw one photograph which looks like a bag of rubbish, and it is a big bag of garbage that's there, not a little tiny, shower cap looking thing. So I don't know about that particular thing. But now there's a lot of other things. There's the rock with the letter C on it. NASA said it was a hair on the negative. Someone reminded me if there was a hair on the negative, the hair would have been white and not black. It does kind of look like a hair. The little fold in what we thought was a paper mache rock, which indeed it might be a paper mache rock. It might be a real rock. Who cares? That little fold isn't a fold at all. That is a shadow of an antenna that actually touched the edge of the rock. So once you relook at that photograph, you'll start seeing the shadow and you start realizing we were wrong about that being a fold in the rock. So again, we've had things pushed up there. We're eager to find out what proves this right or wrong. And so sometimes we do fall for disinformation or just a bad interpretation of stuff. So brace yourself when you do start looking at stuff. That's why I'm going at sort of the core sciences of what their claims are, so that we can nip this in the bud way ahead of time before we get to those sort of fringy pieces of potential evidence or not. So they complete the mission. But whatever one you want to pick. They got to get back inside the vehicle, being 3 feet wide with a 2-foot door. Fail. But let's just say there's some spongy attribute to this whole thing. Now this thing has to take off and rendezvous with the service module going in orbit. Some poor guy up there didn't get to go to the moon surface. That must really suck, Maybe you fear dying if you were really going to do it, so you'd think you're lucky stars. But again, this whole thing is fake anyway. As I've been told, it's an explosive that's underneath the top part of the limb. Blows it into space. There's that famous shot of it doing it and the camera that tracks it up. Now, a lot of folks said, how could that have happened? Because who would have operated the camera? I've heard ludicrous stories about the fact the camera is actually being controlled from Houston. And the more realistic explanation was it's just timed. Because they understand, they kind of would understand how fast the thing's going to go up, and you just send a signal out to the camera with this automated rotation thing, and you say, look, you start rotating split second after the signal comes to you because we're going to blow this thing up, and there you got your footage. But how they get that footage back down to Earth, I have no idea. You can't transmit it. Come on, what did you leave a giant broadcasting array up there and the power to do it? Oh, and speaking of delays, President Nixon did a phone call with the astronauts, and the delays required to have that conversation are absolutely not in the conversation. So they kind of started off okay, and then they started going too quickly and replying too fast to him. Again, it's a 2 to 3 second delay just to get a signal perfectly broadcast between the moon and the Earth, supposedly. How much power it takes to do that, someone in broadcasting might let me know. But then it's got to travel all the wires on Earth and get to the White House. Then he's got to figure out what he's going to say, and he says it back, and then it's going to be the whole thing back the other way, and someone else has to figure out what they're going to say. You see this on Earth in 2019. I just saw an interview with someone who was a different part of the world. I think it was someone in the East Coast of America interviewing someone in the Middle East about something. I think it was the Iranian drone attack or whatever it was, and they were having a hard time keeping this conversation in sync. A lot of waiting, we know what's going on, so we have patience for the wait, but my God, going to the moon in 69, that conversation coming back, that conversation with Nixon would have been a mess had it even been possible. So if you want to see a laughable reveal of the fakery, there you go. Now what started to happen is, that is such a screw up on their part that they floated this story that Nixon did fake that conversation. That was 100% fake. In fact, there's bodies of scientists that will say, well, Apollo 11 was fake. The whole thing was fake, but all the other missions were real. Well, why the hell did they look exactly the same then? What did the astronauts go out and dust off the legs for the other 5 missions to make sure it was as spick and span as the first one? Yeah, right. Obviously, I'm overlooking a tremendous number of things. I've got other episodes. Go to deepthoughtsradio.com, click on NASA, moon missions, moon hoax, or whatever in the categories list, and you'll find all the episodes that go into meticulous detail with video reference while you watch, for those on podcast. But here they are. Okay. They are blasting off from the surface of the moon with an explosive, which is going to be as arbitrary as possible, right? You don't get... there's little retro cones, again, on the outside. But again, if you're off a single degree, or a fraction of a single degree, you are not going to make your rendezvous with the service module. You just won't. And yet this thing worked perfect 6 times. And here's the thing. Ask a fighter pilot if the very first thing they do is become a Top Gun pilot. First mission out, man, you get in that plane, you've read all the books, you just hop behind the cockpit, and you go off to war, and you fight a Top Gun attack. First mission. Hell no. You've got to ride along. You don't get to touch the stick for a long time. You practice on little tiny planes. You build yourself up to a big, $50 million, fighter jet. Well, none of these astronauts could have ever practiced the rendezvous to go down to the moon surface, land safely, and come back up and rendezvous with the service module. No practice at all, but perfect every single time. Ridiculously perfect. If they wanted to inject some Apollo 13, almost everyone died moments, they should have synthesized something with that particular rendezvous where one of them took, an extra half day to get it to work, and it was, they had to fart out a window to get the proper push, something like that, right? Nope, perfect every time. Here come the astronauts through the little hole there into the service module capsule, and then of course they cut the limb top part loose to just, crash back down on the planet of the moon, which again pollutes the surface of the moon, which we're not supposed to do to our greatest extent. So then that big booster on the back, which has had all this already, I should say, it's already been used to escape the Earth's gravity. It's already been used to get in orbit around the moon, and it still has plenty of fuel to escape the moon's gravity and get back to Earth. And how would that work? Let's say you could pull it off. You can't, but let's say you could. Here you are screaming at the surface of the Earth, and you've got to do another slingshot thing, which means your first orbit is going to be really oblong and long, and then you're going to continually descend down to the point where now you've totally stabilized low orbit again. Low orbit. I mean, you're going in the Van Allen belts, out of the Van Allen belts, in the Van Allen belts, out of the Van Allen. It's just the most absurd assertion of science you have ever heard in your life, okay? Well, let's just say magic happens, right? NASA magic happens. Supposedly perfected in Apollo 8. Okay. Well, they're going to jettison the back of this service module with the motor on it. The thing that looks just like the excursion to the moon from 1908. Now you got this capsule. 3 guys inside. Well, there's a couple things that are going to happen. You got this blast shield on the bottom because you're going to come in completely non-intuitive to the shape of this object. The bottom first. Any of you know how to shoot guns? How many times have you ever had the bullet turn around and the butt hits the target, not the pointy side? Never. Go look at all these Project Aurora ships that the Russians have, we have. It's all bullet shaped, and it flies in the path of the bullet because the path of least resistance. You're starting to hit atmosphere. That's a natural shape to cut atmosphere out of the way. And it's so delicate. Ask a SR-71 pilot, a B-1 or a B-2 or a B-2E or whatever the new one is. If they make so much as a correction that's too intense, if the computer wasn't helping them fly, basically, they'd rip the ship apart because it'd start tumbling and everybody would die. The ship would just disintegrate. Okay. So we have a bullet-shaped object coming into the atmosphere, butt first. Now, how many of you have done this? You have taken one of those medicine ball, or not, one of those exercise balls, right? And you try to sit on it. And it's sort of wobbly, right? Because you're trying to put your center of gravity on this ball. There's even folks that put like square planks on the ball and they step on them. This is like a circus trick. And they're wobbling and wobbling and wobbling because it's rough. Okay. So you have the butt of this bullet-shaped object hitting this variable density atmosphere at an incredible amount of speed, according to the books. Well, the atmosphere isn't perfectly uniform, and it's pushed back against the capsule, and 3 guys inside also have an issue that they're not the same weight and stuff's not perfectly distributed inside this thing, so the force pushing down isn't uniform either. I've said this several times, but I saw an animation that a guy, I believe from Caltech, did where he simulated this and simulated the atmosphere in engineering software, and every single time he tried to make that bullet-shaped object come in on its butt, it immediately turned and started flipping. So violently, obviously, that the astronauts inside would be utter human scrambled eggs. It'd be horrific. Somehow, you see the footage, they land with the 3 parachutes, the parachutes that are the size of your frickin' house, each one of them, right? That's almost not an exaggeration, folks. But where do they keep the parachutes? I just went and looked it up. They say it's inside this inner cone, such that when they crawl through that little aperture to get to the lunar module, there's an inner cone inside that, and the parachute's sort of tucked in there. One of our listeners went off and did a deep dive on this, and he said that he was officially told that the parachutes were packed, again, to the density of the bark on a tree. Okay. How many of you have seen those funny videos online? I guess they're funny, where someone tricks their friend to sit on a airbag, and then they pop it, and the guy flies 15 feet in the air and probably breaks his fucking back and ruptures discs. So funny. But they do that. They trick a person to sit on a sofa. Boom. Those concussion chutes, they're not parachutes, but they're definitely something that needs to inflate quickly, have a powder in them that explodes. And that's how that thing unravels super fast before your face plants inside the steering wheel or dashboard or whatever. A parachute packed as dense as bark would simply come out and be this solid thing. There is no way to put a little parachute attached to the big parachute and have it go and unravel. Not even at supersonic speeds would you be able to do this. You can't pull a parachute out at supersonic speeds. It would just rupture and kill everybody inside by the violent ride and shock wave that would happen to your body. So how did they do this? This is where it becomes a bit of a mystery even to myself. I believe the astronauts went to low orbit, sat there the entire time. All the tuna can things that Buzz Aldrin was doing, it's all in low orbit. That way you kind of get some folly gravity. Could be a vomit rocket. You get a 747, you go way up in the air and you dive down to the ground. You got 60 seconds to play around with the tuna can. Maybe. Seems like they were faking shots of the Earth using the portal window. Go see a funny thing happen on the way to the moon. You got to see that movie. If you're slightly interested in this and you haven't seen that movie and you haven't seen Astronauts Gone Wild, you're doing yourself a disfavor. Bart Sabrell has done the world a big card of justice in making both those films. I own both of them. He signs them. It's cool. Put you out $70, but you're going to be supporting a dude that kind of led us down a path that we needed to go. So, the alternate theory is that this thing is pushed out of the back of a jumbo jet. The chutes are there. They automatically, catch the wind, and now they splash land in the ocean. Now, if you're 200 miles up, maybe these parachutes are not just inside this little capsule thing. They could be outside. They could be ugly. You don't get to see in the first place. But here they come. They scream down. Again, don't understand the blast plate thing. There's also this mysterious blackout zone that ends up occurring, which they blame on atmospheric conditions, the thermal radiation on the outside of the ship, can't get signals through it. I think that's probably been invented to switch feeds from non-top secret feeds to super top secret feeds where these astronauts can follow their script. Bart Sabrell's movie A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, he not only shows you the footage that they faked of the moon faked of the Earth in reverse chronological order using a window, but he also reveals the fact that in one of the conversations with Neil Armstrong doing this fake shot, there seems to be a third voice on the track which doesn't have any distortion, which tells them to talk. And it's huge. It's a huge reveal. They're trying to guide the astronauts to have the 4-second delay that they need to keep up the illusion that they're traveling in space going towards the moon. Now, we did it. We're back on the ocean surface. They're getting picked up by the Navy, heroes, ticker tape parades, all that good stuff going on. I always like to bumper these episodes at the very end with a little bit of lucidity about the moment. It's a repetition between episodes, but it's something I think that we need to think about, because I definitely run into people that are extremely angry at, especially the astronauts, for hanging on to the deception. Now, it would appear that Buzz Aldrin just told an 8-year-old girl that they didn't go to the moon. That's pretty interesting. He seems to be losing it. He has lost it 2 or 3 times in the past, admitting that they didn't go. One of the most famous ones I can't find anymore, which is him taking an interview with some news channel late at night, and he says the words, and a bunch of you have seen this and you've commented on this. It's supposedly in a Jeranism video, so for anyone to do me a huge favor, find the Jeranism video with this in there. But Buzz Aldrin says, live on television, because they're asking him about getting to Mars, he said, well, once we figure out how to go to the moon, it'll be a lot easier to get to Mars. There's a beat in the script. The guys on the other side is a woman and a man looking at him. They go, well, what do you mean? And they said he was tired. All right, well, I don't know any other word you could substitute in his sentence besides the moon. Okay, they would have tried the rovers on Mars, on the moon, had they really gone. You're going to try the nearest body with your brand new invention. Here we've got all these rovers supposedly from India and China, and Israel tried it just recently. I think the astronauts have been threatened to a degree that in the 60s and 70s, anybody would have responded to this. Plus, some of the guys will enjoy the rest of their life being heroes that went to the moon. Makes sense. Problem, Gus Grissom and his other 2 buddies were murdered in Apollo 1 because he said this thing could go to the moon. They had to get rid of the guy. He wasn't going to lie. Boom. Death, murder, crime. What's the whole moon mission thing about? It's probably got several objectives. Inspiring the world to get into technology, which worked, to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and 2, to develop the most superior miniaturized intercontinental ballistic missiles that could be fit in a Trident submarine. It's military. I mean, think about it. We just had this Cuban crisis in '63 where Khrushchev is putting missiles in Cuba going, oh, we're going to bomb you guys. And so internally they're like, okay, let's say we're going to the moon right away and just do whatever it takes to get the money funneled into the right black projects to get this thing done. Rocketdyne engines matter. Everything matters. Everything is usable. It's a V3 rocket program, if you will. Why is this important in 2019? Well, it is probably the softest conspiracy you can get yourself involved in, which reveals how the world really works. The fact that it's still being covered up today shows you that the corruption continues to live. As I always say, this whole thing is out of sight, out of mind. As soon as the Saturn V leaves your sight, it's all Hollywood. And that's the way all that stuff works. SpaceX launching a Tesla rover into space. All Hollywood, all fake. Elon Musk, I don't know. I think the guy is a very bright man. I think he knows he's being controlled by a deep state, and I think he's trying to break free of the whole thing. Good luck. You can expect him to have some accident at some point in his life. My call out to him would be, you get to a very safe place and spill your guts on live television somewhere, live internet feed or something. Tell the world that you think they're going to kill you because you said what you said, and then stay in the public eye the entire time. Reveal all on the first day. So then the only thing that'll happen to you would be a punishment arc and not a you got more to reveal arc, right? Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. This will be the final episode on the moon, probably this season, to be honest, because I don't know where else I could take it. If something else reveals itself, we'll get into it. Now, we will continue most likely covering Mars developments, other rover developments, space station developments, throughout the episodes. So there's going to be more material coming in this genre, but if any of you could think of something I haven't covered that could last an hour, I'm all ears, but I don't want to keep repeating myself because it's already getting kind of nauseous for me to continue doing this over and over and over again. But I think we revealed in the last 2 episodes some new stuff, or some clarifications, albeit small. But if you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. That's where everything is. 2 video, 2 audio, 2 social media, mainly the discussions in our locked Facebook group. Definitely come in. When you sign up, definitely answer the question, say something human, or you're going to get banned. I blocked 2 or 3 folks because I went to their page and they're selling things. So they want to lure you into their, hey, buy this now thing. It's like, no thanks. If you want to be legitimately in this group, you need to have a clean profile page, or just say something human and I'll let you through. I need to know that you're real. We don't need any more trolls on our situation. All subscriptions have almost halted. YouTube subscriptions, we got a little bit of a bump this last week, but if I can get 10 of my friends to join, YouTube will take away 8. It's just that way. And sometimes they take away like 15. Facebook, we've only had a couple requests to join that group in, my gosh, in the last 6 months. It used to be several a week. Now it's just nothing. So the shadow banning is definitely real. You need to know that every single video I post gets demonetized immediately, and then I have to petition, and then they all get granted monetization. So that's where we are right now. With the website, you have all the episodes plus a remastered season 1. So if you go to this channel and you try to find season 1, it's not there. Go to the website, click season 1. It's a whole different channel. And the main reason why I did that is it took me a year to remaster everything, and I didn't want to have low number digits throwing off the count of this channel. So I created a separate channel. So it's all there. There won't be any more videos attached to it. But just make it easy on yourself. Kick off from deepthoughtsradio.com, and you'll always find the right episode that I want you to see. If you want to hear how the episodes were originally prepared, you can listen to the podcast version of the original episodes, but most podcast software doesn't allow you to go back 400 entries. So we'll stop around 300. It's just, they have to draw a limit at some point, right? Anyway, till the next episode, take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over now.